Good morning, everyone. Okay, so it's 10:30 and it's time to get this webinar started. So first of all, welcome to this webinar on how to design learning for online delivery. Before we get started, let's cover a few basics. Remember that you can post your questions as we go into the question box throughout, and the team will try to answer them as we go, but please be patient because there are a lot of you here today. Secondly, you can't use audio. Everyone's muted except me, as there are so many of you. So in terms of what today is all about in a general sense, well, the aim of these webinars is to support training providers having to move swiftly to delivering learning online. So as part of that, my focus is going to be very much on practical things rather than theory. And I'm going to try to start right at the beginning without assuming any prior knowledge on your part. Now, I know that there's going to be a wide spread of experience amongst you, which means that some of you may not be very confident or experienced at doing this, but as the saying goes, everything's easy when you know how. So this session will teach you a bit about how to design learning for online delivery so you can get started. So, who am I? My name's Daniel Whiston, and I've been a learning designer for over 20 years. That's an actual job role, also called an instructional designer. The two terms are pretty much synonymous. But what is a learning designer? Well, it's not a content expert necessarily, although you can be an LD and an expert at something like finance or music or health and safety, but rather at its core, an LD is someone who decides consciously and logically what people will learn and how it will be presented to them in an online environment, which is a core skill that your team will need if you're going to be working in this area. Now, if you're going to be learning how to do this, it might be a term you want to Google perhaps afterwards, as there are a lot of ID and LD resources out there, some of which I'll be showing you later on. Now, over the last 20 years, I've designed hundreds of modules, courses, scenarios, videos, animations, simulations, and games. And I've also designed online degrees, performance support tools, learning apps, graphic novels, infographics, and more. But underlying all of those very different outputs are the learning design skills I'm going to be covering today. So let's look at what we're going to cover coming up. Somebody just asked a question, I think, of whether the slides will be available afterwards, and yes, they will. But to move on, here we see the learning outcomes for today. So I'm going to talk about a lot of different things, but the core focus is going to be learning design, which is something you need to understand if you're going to teach people stuff online. Now, on a quick point, I'm not going to be covering graphics and visuals. Many people think about that when you say the word design, but that's not what I'm covering. Visuals are important, but I'm covering design in the sense of deciding what you're going to teach people and how, in order to consciously design an effective online learning experience. So let's look to learning design in more detail. In fact, it's the approach I've used to put this workshop together. So to show you what I mean, here's how I decided what to do today. I'll touch on these elements in more detail again as we go. So I started by drafting some learning outcomes for today. I used these to decide on what to teach you. Now, a learning outcome is a specific way of defining what a learner should understand or be able to explain or describe or contrast or any other kind of cognitive task once they've been through a piece of learning content. So here, my learning outcomes for the session are, as you can see, first one, learners will be able to explain the basics of designing for virtual delivery, and so on and so forth. As a quick aside, using learning outcomes to build a structure for online learning content also provides a clear way to structure assessments and tests, which can also then be based around them. Moving on from learning outcomes, I thought it would be too passive for me to just talk. So I've built in 3 pieces of interactivity to engage my learners. That's you guys. There's one at the beginning, one in the middle, and one at the end to keep you all awake, hopefully. And it's not just about me telling you stuff. Online learning should combine courses and resources, as the phrase goes. You tell people how to do things, and then you give them resources so they can go and do it. So there'll be some resources at the end. And now, if you give me a moment, I'm going to open the first poll. Here's the first piece of interactivity I just referred to a moment ago, a poll. So let's get a sense of where you all are. As of now, where are you sitting? Okay, lots of activity there, which is great. At the moment, in my home office is beating at the kitchen table by quite a wide margin, but 3% of people are in the bath. So that's quite down. Well, 2% now. Someone's feeling self-aware. Okay, well, I'm lucky enough to have a home office, but I can see that quite a few of you, actually 9% are on the sofa, which I imagine does make it hard to concentrate sometimes. Okay, so I'm now closing that poll. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, so let's get stuck in and look at the basics of designing for virtual delivery. So this content relates to the first learning outcome I showed on the previous slide. Learners will be able to explain the basics of designing for virtual delivery. So that's learners as in everyone here today, and that's what we're going to cover first. So this may seem like a very open area. Let's get specific. I feel there are 4 key steps to take. Step 1. The best place to start is by making a high-level content plan for your online content. Personally, I literally start this off with a blank sheet of paper where I map my online knowledge requirement against my learner profiles. This works for modules, courses, videos, whatever. In other words, decide what you should be teaching your audience based on 1, what they need to know, and 2, who they are. Now, this applies in terms of any amount of content, whether an online course lasting for weeks or writing a 1-minute video and everything in between. So in terms of 1, what do your learners need to know? The answer could be defined by an exam curriculum, a compliance requirement, a task they have to master, a personal competency they need to improve, or many other things. And then 2, who are the learners specifically? Crucially, you need to ask yourself questions like, what's their prior knowledge in this specific area? What do they know already? Are they experts or beginners? What's their general educational background? How motivated are they? How much stimulation do they require? What are their tastes? Would they appreciate humor, examples, visuals, reading, something else? Are there any cultural issues to consider? How confident are they? Now, it can be a very long list, but there are clearly some basics to be considered. And once you've answered those 2 questions, what your learners need to know and who they are, you have what you might call your high-level plan, the content you're going to cover aimed at a specific group of people. This shapes this shapes everything else that you're going to do afterwards. Step 2. Now, step 2 is simpler. You take your high-level plan and you flesh it out with a list of learning outcomes based on the content you're going to cover and your knowledge of your audience. Learning outcomes should be specific, measurable, and achievable. So use active verbs when you frame them, like explain, describe, list, compare, etc., rather than just saying learners will understand X, Y, Z, because that's too passive and too general. So for example, learners will be able to list the 3 key principles of the university's fire prevention policy, or learners will be able to identify danger areas in a typical workstation. Step 3. Once you have your learning outcomes listed in your plan, think about how to present them. What assets and media do you need to produce? Start on a high level. So for example, you have the live option, which is called a synchronous option using the jargon of the industry. You can have a webinar like this one. It's a live experience where everyone goes through it at the same time. You also have non-live options or non-synchronous options, e-learning modules, videos, podcasts, etc. Or you can go for a blend. For example, a live webinar that's recorded plus downloadable resources like what we're doing now. And then after that, on a more granular level, you need to draft specific learning outcomes that sorry, what I meant to say was drafting specific learning outcomes in this way gives you indicators as how to present them, perhaps on a screen-by-screen basis within an e-learning module. For example, if you want to identify danger areas in a typical workstation, this could be covered by an interactive diagram, a photograph of a workstation, or perhaps a scenario. And then finally, step 4. Now is the time to move away from your high-level design. Once you've decided what content you need to produce, a webinar plus a document or a podcast or an e-learning module or whatever it might be, you need to write a script or at least detailed notes to flesh out every learning outcome you want to cover. This can be really simple in Word or PowerPoint, for example. It doesn't need to be fancy, it just needs to be solid. And you can then use this to guide the webinar, shoot a video, build an e-learning module, or whatever. Now, if you have no idea what a script looks like, then one approach could be to find an example for a movie online, movie script, and adapt the format until it makes sense for whatever it is that you're trying to do. Or you could adapt a PowerPoint presentation for a new purpose. But whatever you do, don't just wing it. Otherwise, it could well go pear-shaped, especially if you're trying to adapt classroom materials at speed. Having a script also helps you to control budgets because it helps you estimate what's involved in building something, and it also helps you collaborate with freelancers and other organizations that you might want to be working with. Okay, here's the second piece of interactivity that I said I designed into the session. So we've looked at some of the basics for designing for online delivery. How confident are you at this point with designing for online delivery? Okay, well, 2% are enormously confident. So I'm pleased to hear that there seems there's some value I can add in this call. Most of you seem to be clustering on quite confident thanks, which is good to hear as well. But a significant amount, actually, at the moment, 45% or so are either not very confident or not confident at all. So a bit of a spread there, which is only to be expected. But remember, don't move quicker than you're comfortable with. Start with what seems manageable, take small steps first, and your confidence will grow. This is something we'll return to later. So let's move on to the next learning outcome. Okay, so here's the second high-level learning outcome for our session today. How learning online differs from learning in the classroom. So let's break this down and look at it in terms of live and non-live online learning experiences. Okay, in terms of live, let's consider a webinar like this one and go through some specific points. So firstly, humor can be dangerous online. People can't see you all the time and you can't see them. In fact, I can't see any of you. So visual cues, body language can be missed, and it can be quite a risky kind of thing to engage in. Whereas if you can see people, humor works very well. Secondly, don't ask rhetorical questions as they can be really confusing. If you are going to ask questions or use polls, position them and signpost them really clearly so everyone understands why they're doing what they're doing. And then prepare your technology, because what can go wrong will go wrong, as I've found on a personal basis far too many times. Rehearse using the platform in advance. Learners rely on you to be the confident expert. So check that videos work, use a headset, have a backup connection, and consider using a co-producer for tech support or even a co-host to do it with you. People do that on television news quite a lot, and it works really well for a reason. You want to use an agenda or at least communicate the structure of the whole thing really clearly. And you want to make sure that everyone's included as much as possible. It's really easy for people to hide in virtual corners. And finally, it really pays to be aware that a virtual environment can amplify behaviors that are also bad offline. Things like interrupting or not ensuring that learners understand or talking too quickly. You can basically lack the social cues you get face to face when you're online, so you need to take that stuff into account as much as possible. Okay, then there's non-live online learning. So let's consider the example of an e-learning module. Basically, you're not there with a student, so you need to compensate for the absent teacher Content needs to be signposted properly, the flow needs to be coherent, needs to be intuitive, and it needs to make sense. Crucially, it also needs to be standalone. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, for example, if we're talking about the second in a series of 3 how-to videos, learners need to be able to understand the second one without having watched the first one. So in that case, use recaps and quick overviews like a TV show that conveys the story so far. Remember, you're writing a piece of media, so it needs to connect with your audience. Sarah, I've been talking for quite a while. Any questions you'd like to pick out at this point?
Not now. We had a question from Susan Easton who asked whether assessment should be integrated into learning design. And we are running, it's not on the list yet, but we are going to run a separate webinar just about assessment. But do you want to say something briefly about the role of assessment in learning design, Dan?
Thank you, Sarah. Absolutely. So that is a really interesting question, and it's something I work with a lot as a practitioner. I would say that it partly depends on the wider context of what you're trying to teach. So, for example, if you're a college or there's some kind of accreditation or exam or something like that, then, for example, you may want to map your learning outcomes against an assessment framework, and that would help you make sure you're teaching the right things so that people can then pass the exam or be assessed and be successful. More informally, if we're talking about assessing people's knowledge within a non-formal learning experience, you still want to check that people are absorbing the information you want. So you might want to have, a quiz at the beginning and the end, so you can see, for example, what people scored before they went through the learning intervention and what they scored at the end, and that would hopefully give you some indication of return on investment, as it were, or the positive impact that your knowledge program is having on people. Okay, so I'm going to carry on now, I think, having touched on that point, but thanks for asking. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to the third of today's learning outcomes. Learners will be able to explain what works online and what doesn't. Okay, so in other words, how can you identify which content is suitable for online delivery? Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that you can teach almost anything online as long as you follow some learning design basics. So what works? Well, I'd say content of any kind that is chunked into relatively small or short pieces that can potentially be combined to make bigger learning experiences. And secondly, content that's based around learning outcomes that are clearly related to something you know your learners actually need and are aimed at a specific learner profile. For example, you've accurately calibrated the existing knowledge levels, the tastes and content of your audience, how old they are, how formal they want to be, that kind of thing. That will then work to a greater or lesser extent. What doesn't work? Well, literal translations of classroom or face-to-face content. You need to adapt it to fit online. So let's look at some classic errors. Number one will be content dumping. People have a limited attention budget. They can absorb less than you think they can. So it's a classic error to try to fit in too much. For example, that might mean a webinar session that's far too long. I intend for the talking part of this one to be about 30 minutes, and I suggest that as a good rule of thumb. Or another example of too much content might be trying to cram far too much text on screen. So remember, less is more when it comes to online learning. Second thing that makes things not work online is a lack of interactivity. I'm assuming here that you're putting something together, something sustained like a webinar or an e-learning module. Don't just try to transmit knowledge in a passive way that assumes your learners will just sit back and let you talk at them. They'll simply tune out. The online learning experience needs to be active and task-based on a regular basis. And three, it won't work if you make assumptions about your learners that turn out to be inaccurate. For example, you might estimate that their existing knowledge level is actually much higher than it is, so you won't start at the beginning. Or you might get it the other way around and underestimate how much they already know and bore them. So wherever possible, profile your learners, talk to them if you can. And now it's the last of today's learning outcomes. Learners will be able to list some quick actions they can take to get started. So first off for me will be mapping your existing content offering if you have one. What can you deliver online quickly and easily if you repurpose it? What do the people you're trying to reach value? What do they need? Take those 2 points, see where they intersect, and start there. Then, is there new content you can produce quickly? Stuff you've never covered before, perhaps something topical. If so, don't be afraid of, for example, simple documents. If they're thought through and are written to decide with the audience in mind, they'll be a hit. Podcasts are easy to record, as are videos on your phone, or live sessions are a quick way to go, like this one. Another thing to consider, what can you deliver in meaningful chunks? Break it down. What are the smallest or shortest pieces of content that will be useful for your learners? Again, 30-minute webinars, 15-minute podcasts, short documents that consist of how-to guides, top tips, case studies. All of these enable you to start feeding your audience quickly. You also need to decide on a platform. Now, I'm not really covering tech tools today, but how are people going to access the stuff that you make? Links from your website, YouTube, Facebook, you take advantage of. You might want to use something specialist like a learning management system, and free ones are available. But whatever you do, keep it simple and shape the content to the publishing platform that's quickest and easiest for you to use. Finally, sketch out a plan for moving forward. For example, is e-learning for you? There's free or very affordable software options, and building modules and courses gives you assets you can combine into a catalog and then scale up. Separately, how will you evaluate what you're doing, get feedback, and respond to it? It doesn't need to be fancy. You could ask your friends and your family, but just realizing that you need to get feedback and test stuff will be invaluable, and it will help you protect your reputation. Then how will you promote your offering? For example, LinkedIn is very active with online learning businesses. And then what's your strategy? You need to get started, and you may not have done this before, so keep it simple. Focus on stuff that you can do quickly and that your learners will really value. Do some high-level designs and high-level plans for those. Develop assets and live sessions to support those, and then build on it. But as much as possible, so that you can build a coherent offering piece by piece, and then pivot towards what works as you get feedback. Okay, here is the third and final piece of interactivity I said I designed into this session. So we've looked at some quick actions that people can take to get started. What will you do first? Okay, interesting. Producing brand new content is by far the least popular option. The other two are equally weighted. Very few of you are thinking of striking out into new territory immediately. It's a halfway split between people who are going to try a bit of something new and repurpose existing stuff, or people who are just going to go for repurposing existing. Interesting. Again, a spread of responses there. Now, I'm going to close the poll. As a practitioner point, I use the interactivity here to reinforce and consolidate a key learning point that we just covered, which is something that can be really effective as well as producing a nice pace and keeping people awake. So that's something you might like to try in future. Okay, we're almost done with the me talking bit now. So let's look at some of those resources I mentioned. First of all, commercial organizations. Now, the internet is a wide and wonderful place of infinite variety, and there is value to be had from company websites, but be aware of commercial agendas, hidden or not so hidden. Companies like Leo and Kideo, which are the two largest e-learning organizations in the UK, they will have white papers, they will have podcasts, they will have all sorts of advice and resources, but they are selling a service. So be careful to make your own judgments about what you might want to use. Then you have practitioners. Practitioners can be really valuable in terms of blogs and personal sites. People who do this stuff every day that you can learn from. Kathy Moore, for example, is very well known in the community for designing active learning content. Then you have networks and consultancies. The eLearning Network is a UK coaching and mentoring and resource-based network that you might want to look at. Instructionaldesign.org has a great conceptual overview, and Learning Light is one of several agencies who give good reviews and articles on the UK scene. Then it may be that you want to recruit your own team. You may want to recruit specialists. You may want to recruit people like myself, instructional designers. You may want learning designers. You may want visual designers. You may want technical people who can make learning management systems work. You can hire these people as either contractors or freelancers, and these are some of the agencies you might want to use. There are many others around. I just include those for indicative purposes. And then finally, it turns out that face-to-face trainers and educators are having to adapt to online learning due to the coronavirus on a global basis. A quick web search turned up these articles from the past few days alone. So remember, you're not alone, and the best place to learn new skills is very often from each other. Okay, so I'm almost done now in terms of the active part of the presentation. Let's look at a quick summary. Online learning presents a real opportunity, but don't try to move too quickly. Start with an area of content and a tech platform that you're most comfortable with. Write a high-level design based around learning outcomes. Write a script before you develop or deliver anything. Define your learners as quickly as possible and get feedback and use it to improve. Okay, Sarah, I think there's probably quite a few questions, some of them about the sound, but some of them about other stuff too. So if you'd like to feed me some questions, let's get going with the Q&A.
Okay, right. The first question is, there are two which are roughly the same, which is about the ideal duration for the delivery of an online session. And that comes from Brendan and Dawn, just asking what is the maximum online training session time?
Okay, well, I would say if you're talking about an e-learning module, then I really wouldn't go much beyond half an hour. For me, if you're making a video or an animation, I'd look to YouTube, and really effective stuff is a couple of minutes. And then a webinar like this, again, I would probably go with the e-learning kind of metric and say around about 30 minutes for the part of it that you're expecting people to sit and listen. And that would be the upper limit there. I think after that, you can give people tasks, you can give them things to do, and that can be much longer. But in terms of the lesson-like experience, I think half an hour for anything protracted and beyond that, I think you need to break it up into a second lesson or module.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. And thanks for people asking the questions. I have another question here from Steve, who's asking, is there any advice for running more facilitated sessions remotely, such as team-based problem-solving sessions?
I think with something like that, you need the right kind of technology, which is something that we'll be covering in a future webinar to make sure everyone can access it properly, because you know that to be inclusive, you need to avoid assuming that everyone has the same kind of bandwidth and the same kind of device availability. So it's important to do research in advance of the sessions themselves to make sure everyone can take part on an equal basis. In terms of designing the content, without knowing exactly what the content is, it's hard to be really specific, but I would say you need to strike a balance between planning the kind of core learning path where you're going to transmit knowledge to people, and then taking the time to plan really engaging case studies and active tasks, maybe simulations that they can do around that knowledge base that are going to be testing, that are going to be non-obvious and are going to really challenge people. Because one of the things that really lets online learning down is when people design interactions of any type and they're just far too easy, basically. They need to really push people's capabilities and be stretching, but also it needs to be reasonable for them to achieve those things within the time you've given them. And that can be quite a balancing act. And I think that's where a lot of creativity and skill can be applied to produce something very engaging. But if you don't go through that preparation, then it can fall a bit flat sometimes.
Thanks, Dan. I think that answer may well apply to Gary's question, who says, we have a successful face-to-face delivery of training. What are the top tips to move this to live online sessions? And he says that these are usually full day learning sessions and very interactive.
Okay, well, I'm going to assume that this isn't something that is being done at the moment by the person who asked it, that it's a new venture for them. So obviously I refer them back to various things I said about profile your learners, about what they really want in the first instance, because I'm again going to assume it's something that has to be maybe sold to people as being worth their while. So I would probably choose the content area where the most demand exists in the short term. And if it's something that fits itself around the current epidemic and current kind of economic pressure that many businesses are facing, all the better. So you really want to make it something that sells itself in terms of what's in it for people in terms of participating. And then if it's the first time to venture to online learning, I would try and keep it simple, even though it's a day long, and simplicity is going to be difficult after a certain point because it's going to be so much content. I would still break it down into shorter chunks, have lots of breaks, have lots of pauses where people go and do things, and don't require people to sit and absorb stuff for any too long a stretch at one point. Because to refer back to what I was saying a minute ago about, say, half an hour cap on an e-learning module, I still think that for day-long programs, there's a lot of value to be had for designing them in bursts, in sprints, in chunks, and then pacing it with offline stuff or tasks people can do around those bursts of being together, because it's easy to burn out and lose people's attention.
Thanks, Dan. Useful stuff. Debbie,
sorry, to that, I would say, oh, sorry, Sarah.
No, that's fine.
I would say preparation is quite important in terms of that learner profiling. So if you could just make sure that you've validated your join the online day, that can be quite useful too, so that everyone's starting at the same level. So you might want to have some pre-work to make sure no one's struggling when they join the live session.
Yes, good advice to give people pre-work.
Okay, Sarah?
Please. Yeah, that's fine. Sorry, Dan, you broke up slightly then. Maybe that's a very big topic, and possibly something we think about doing a separate webinar on later on in this series. And I'm going to return to the future webinars when we get to the end of this. Can I just pass you this very interesting question from Debbie, who asks, what are the advantages of a podcast over a webinar?
Hello, Sarah. I seem to have lost you. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you now. Did you just hear that question, which is what are the advantages of a podcast over a webinar?
No, I didn't, Sarah. Could you say that again?
What are the advantages of a podcast over a webinar?
A podcast can be archived more easily and it can retain its value more over time, I think. So it can help you build up a catalogue of assets. You can record a webinar, but it's probably going to be less focused and less like reading a chapter from a book or going through an e-learning module or an instructional film. You can probably build a series of them more efficiently. For a small organization, the resource demand is lower, so you might be able to produce more of them more quickly as well.
Okay, thanks for that. I have several questions here on tools, and I don't know whether you want to ask these on this forum. Somebody's asking that whether you would recommend using LearnPress if you already have a WordPress website.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to defer that to the technical webinar because WordPress is not my area.
Okay, that's fine.
Apologies.
All right, here's a design question. Come along to the tools webinar next week if you have questions around tools and how to choose them. So this obviously this webinar is about design, and Sarah Hughes is asking, how can you design something online that facilitates conversation between participants?
That facilitates conversation between participants. Interesting. So that would have to be a live event. So I would say, now I have to come out and say that that isn't something I've personally designed, but I would imagine that what would work well is if you have a two-phase approach, that you have the first part of, say, a webinar or a virtual classroom with the teacher positioning, what it is, what skills have to be practiced. So for example, if you're learning how to talk to each other, communication skills, you might have the first 15 minutes teaching theory and practice, top tips, techniques, and then you might curate a series of interactions between people that the presenter facilitates. So I would imagine, for example, if you had 2 or 3 areas of conversational practice that you wanted to focus on, such as negotiation or difficult conversations, that you might then set up each mini activity between 2 or 3 participants and say something like, okay, guys, for the next 5 minutes, I want you to have a conversation about topic X. You might provide them with a sample script in a Word document. Challenges, you might get them to role play based on different personas that you've defined in advance that drop out of the learning outcomes that you've already covered at the start. And then you might perhaps monitor in the background that conversation as your participants engage in it and drop in and out, offering commentary and guidance, and then a summary at the end. But I would tend to keep those activities between the participants fairly short and focused, because if you're all online together and can't see each other, it might be quite easy to drift off script and for the thing to break down after a certain point.
Thanks, Dan. That's useful. I have a question from Julius, who's asking about how you train as a learning designer. And Julius is asking, what online course at certificate level would you recommend for a new beginner or prospective learning designer?
Sorry, Sarah, could you repeat the question about the prospective learning designer?
Yes, certainly. Effectively, Julius is asking what online courses there are to learn learning design. And so that would be somebody who's just at the beginning or wanting to become a learning designer.
Very good question. I'm really sorry that I don't know of any formal courses. I would look at the 3 links I'd sent as a starting point from the organizations and networks, because they would be a good source of information about things like that. I'm not aware, for example, of a CPD that's oriented towards learning design or a degree or an apprenticeship, although it may well be that such things exist. I haven't come from that background myself, but I think like the e-learning network, for example, in one of the slides, would be a very good place to ask that question, and they may well have things that they organize themselves. They certainly have coaching and mentoring programs they offer, for example.
That's great. Thanks, Dan. Here's another question on design from Scotty. And Scotty's asking, saying, I'm struggling to turn my highly interactive, facilitated face-to-face delivery style to online. And then Scotty's saying in his delivery, he asks questions every few minutes face-to-face. So how can you translate that very interactive face-to-face style into an interactive delivery style online?
Okay, 2 thoughts. One is that you might want to retain the element of the live coaching with lots of questions that you currently offer by having shorter live sessions like the one we're having now with a smaller number of participants. But you might want to expand your offering by producing resources that go around those. So presumably you're aware of different kind of areas that people want to discuss across different live sessions. FAQs they have, for example, common challenges or development activities that you recommend. So I'd imagine that you could bolster the live sessions that you could continue to offer via Skype or Zoom or something else with online assets people can use afterwards or possibly before to expand on what you tell them in the time that you're being with them on a live basis. And then as you continue to gather kind of updated insights into your customer base, learner base through those interactions, you could bolster those resources and release them, in updates every week. You could have a kind of podcast summary or decision tree diagrams, infographics, things like that. I mean, clearly, I don't know what kind of content you offer, but I think if you keep as the core of your delivery that the live element, you might need to make it more focused and slimmed down, because obviously that would limit how much you could do on a per learner basis. You can't do 1,000 at the same time. But if that is what your customers need and the active questioning is a core part of it, I think you should keep that, but try and focus it as much as possible and put a time limit on those sessions and then bolster them and add more value by surrounding it with a kind of network of or a resource bank of other things they can do before and afterwards. And then presumably you could then offer those resources to other learners who don't speak to you face to face on a more geographically distributed basis. Your business could perhaps grow and reach more people than you were previously by leveraging the insights you get from those live experiences and making them into documents, e-learning, podcasts, and all the rest of it.
Thanks. That's great. Do you know what? The next question from Sally, I am going to answer myself. And Sally's asking, is it easy to bring in 2 presenters from 2 different locations? And the answer to that is yes, because Dan and I are not in the same room. In fact, we're not even in the same town. And the other people who are working on this webinar, Faye and Manjinder, are not in the same place either. So it is really easy. You can do it.
Yep, absolutely. Over to you, Sarah.
Right, another question I have from another Sarah, who's asking, can you have interaction in terms of learners with audio on in a smaller group? My classes are about 30 learners and I'm thinking of using Zoom.
So I'm going to interpret that question to be how many people can talk at the same time, which I'm hoping is what was meant. And my answer there is going to be, I think if you have 30 people talking at the same time in a live learning experience, it would become unmanageable. So I would suggest that you're going to need to come up with a new way of working that perhaps actively manages who can speak at certain points. That you as the presenter, as the leader, are going to have to come up with a really kind of thought through agenda that allows everyone to contribute, perhaps in pairs or smaller groups, but around focused learning points. And then they get a certain window to contribute, and then it moves on to the next person. You might want to rotate through subgroups to make sure everyone has a chance to participate. But I would imagine that otherwise it will become rapidly unmanageable and people won't be able to learn from each other or indeed follow what's going on. So I think you might need to have a strong visual cue of where you are in the meeting. Like I say, an agenda, but that agenda can become quite sophisticated and nuanced, but also time related. And you can give people pockets where they can contribute what they want to or ask you questions. You should also have a text-based back channel, such as the chat function that my colleagues and I have been using on this session. So you can talk to each other, your participants could talk to you. You could be asking questions or comments and feeding them back to the group. But I would let the audio contribution, I'd really think about the potential for that to become disruptive and distracting, but also to keep it alive and let your people speak on a regular basis. But yeah, rotating time slots might be one way to do it.
If I can just add my own little hint here, my top tip for working with audio in groups is to give people cues that they're going to be asked a question and being asked to contribute. While it might be a bit challenging to be put on the spot in a face-to-face environment, in an online environment, what you can be left with is dead air. So what I do is say, I'm going to ask a question on this, and I'm going to Dan, and then I'm going to ask it, and I'm going to ask Manjinder to contribute. And that way everyone can prepare for the fact that they're going to be asked to make a contribution.
Okay. Sarah, to avoid that dead air, is there another question?
There is. Mike, the next question is just from Debbie again, that could you summarize the answer on podcasts, as her sound kept cutting out at that point? So the advantages and disadvantages of podcasts versus webinars.
Yes, so I'm going to say that I think podcasts are something you can record that sound quite professional, that can be built up into a catalogue of assets that you could sell or provide to your learners if you're, commercial, non-commercial, and you could build up that kind of online offering that people can access at any time that has the kind of professional feel of a chapter from a book or a piece of broadcast journalism. And a live webinar is really valuable for generating live questions, making people feel part of a community, and making them feel engaged with you as a teacher, but they can be a bit more rough and ready and hard to control. Not control in terms of discipline, but in terms of what is said and how it's expressed. Things can go wrong, they can be rough edges. So you can record those and make them available, and they can be really valuable, but they'll have a different feel to the podcast. And podcasts can be much more specific and focused. People listen to podcasts because they've chosen to sit back and listen. So you can be more didactic, you can probably teach in a more formal way or go deeper on a certain point. Whereas things like this, they have to appeal to lots of people. So you're probably going to touch on quite a few things on a broad basis, which can be valuable to archive and listen to later on. But the podcast will give you that library feel. And if you're trying to establish yourself as an online learning provider, I imagine it could be quite a practical way to build up an offering which will look substantial to a learner quite quickly.
Okay, thank you for that. That was very useful. There are a couple of questions about the of the presentation. So first of all, Lucy asks, is it possible to have a presenter visible alongside the slideshow? And Brendan asks, is there any background styles that work based in presentations? So both those questions about how best to make a presentation.
Okay, well, again, there will be a technical workshop later on. So I think questions like that are probably more for that one. But just quickly, yes, I believe that you can appear as the presenter by using your webcam at the same time. I know anecdotally, Zoom does give you backgrounds that are available. I think you may have to pay for those, but I haven't used them myself, but I'm aware that people do. So I would look at that platform in the first instance if backgrounds are important to you, but I don't have a good overview of the alternatives. I must be open about that.
Thanks very much, Dan. Then Gary is asking, upfront assessment, what do you need to consider in your upfront assessment? Should you, when you're thinking of your learners in particular, should you consider the learning styles? Should you consider their access to technology?
Sorry, sir, the question about assessments and learning styles, was it?
Yeah, the question is, what do you consider, what are the things that you consider when you're making your upfront analysis or assessment of your learners? Would you consider, for example, their learning style? Would you consider their access to technology?
Absolutely. Yes, I would consider both those things. I think part of my answer will be based on what kind of learning offering you're putting together. The more, if it's a formal one offered by a college, then yeah, and if there's a kind of an exam to be passed or something like that, then I think it becomes even more important, for example, to profile what their previous knowledge level is so they can access the learning you're going to offer. I mean, that's always important. But if they actually need to pass an exam or have some kind of accreditation, then it's really important to make sure they have fair access in a conceptual way to what you're offering. The more what you're offering is informal and relies on people to be motivated by something other than passing an exam, then you really have to make them want to engage with the learning experience. And that's when you have to ask yourself questions that are more like the questions a TV broadcaster or a music producer would ask. What do my people like? Do they like humor? Are they very visually driven? Do they prefer reading things? How old are they? All those kind of questions. What's going to grab them and what's going to make them feel that this content is for me? So I'd say if you draw a kind of an axis, then the more that you can, as it were, rely on an external prod for your learners to come to the table because they have to do it, then it's even more important to probe their existing knowledge to make sure that what you're teaching them is at the right level. But then if you have to draw them in with a variety of kind of, not tricks is the wrong word, but if you have to appeal to them on a more take it or leave it basis, then it makes it even more important to make sure that you're mapping their media preferences and tastes as accurately as you can, so that they won't just get turned off by the nature of what you're doing if they have more of an option to take it or leave it.
Thanks, Dan. The next, I think, really about accessibility, and Brendan's asks, are there any colours that work better for people with a particular learning challenge?
I'm afraid I don't know about colour design and accessibility. Apologies.
That's fine. What I would say is simply make sure that you've got good contrast, and the W3C guidelines are very good for giving you practical information about web design. So strictly speaking, don't put blue on green. Make sure you've got a lot of contrast, and don't put too much information on screen. To come back to online learning virtual sessions, Lucy asks, do you find there is an optimal number of delegates to have per session?
I think the answer to that depends on what you want to do with them. If it's more of a talk and listen experience, then I think it would probably be a much higher number. Because if what you're going to be doing is presenting something which people take notes on and listen, use some polls and perhaps take questions like we're doing now, then you can accommodate hundreds of people. If you do get in that region of learner numbers, then as Sarah's observed, it really helps to work as a team. There are always going to be technical problems. Like, for example, I know my audio has dropped out a few times, but also, and then your co-host can step in. Also, because there's so many of you asking questions, again, Sarah and I collaborating. Sarah's filtering the questions and presenting them to me. That'd be much more challenging if I was doing it on my own. So I would suspect that as soon as you get above a few dozen people, having a co-host or producer or technical support person is really important, but then you can scale up a lot. If you want to have, as a previous questioner suggested, a more intimate experience where you get lots of questions and answers and probing between the facilitator and a number of attendees, then I would think the number will be capped much, much lower. Somebody else who asked a question suggested 30 learners. My instinct is that would be quite challenging. I think you should do some Googling on that one, people who are more experienced than me in that area. Personally, if I was leading a meeting where I was expecting people where people had the expectation that I would have time for them, that I would have time to listen to them properly and respond to what they were saying, then I wouldn't put it above 10 personally, and even that might stretch it a bit. Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. If I can just add to that, if those of you who are familiar with face-to-face training will know that a kind of optimum small group size is probably going to be 8 or 10 if you really want people to communicate, to contribute, and using software where people can do that and see everybody's face on screen and everybody's able to communicate. As a group, as a small group, that will work well. Beyond those numbers, it's still possible to have people with their audio on, but you have got to very much kind of conduct the band and get people to turn their audio off, because there's always going to be somebody who just has a technical problem. So I would say it depends entirely what you want to do. If you're doing something which is more like just broadcast, then a webinar is fine. And there are 122 of you currently online, and obviously you can't all speak at once. For a smaller group, then I would stick to kind of 8 or 10 if you want lots and lots of very strong communication. But basically, the more people you have online, the less the less intimate that communication is going to be. So the next question I'm going to pass over to you, Dan, because this is really your area. So James says, as part of our learning, we play games to embed the learning. What advice do you have to incorporate games into live learning?
Well, thank you, Sarah. So I've written games on and off in a digital learning context over the years, and I always enjoy it immensely as someone who both puts them together and also someone who plays games. So I think I would encourage all of you to think about gamification. That's the phrase you might want to Google, gamification and learning, and there'll be loads of advice out there. I would say simply this: if you have an existing game-based approach that you use face-to-face, I would try and translate that online. Absolutely, if that's what your learners respond well to. Think about the technology of that. It can be quite expensive to construct digital games from scratch, but there are probably lots of really affordable options out there if you want to have a game-like experience. For example, in a webinar, you'd have to look it up yourselves, I'm afraid, because it isn't my core area in terms of the platforms and tools, but they are out there. As an aside, the word gamification has been flavour of the month in online learning for the last half decade, as I'm sure Sarah could agree. But for other people who are listening who didn't ask that question, I think it's worth reflecting on, because it is a trend amongst online learning practitioners. And what they often mean when they say gamification isn't actually, let's make a game about Space Invaders or Pac-Man or whatever it might be. It's more things that you might get from a Netflix or YouTube experience of personalized content, nice graphical menus that break things up into little chunks that you can browse through and find what you want in an appealing way. Things that are designed with a kind of mass market media polish to them, which doesn't have to be expensive, but it's a certain mindset. But to return to what I think the person was asking directly about translating games into an online environment, absolutely, go for it. In the short term, I don't know what the game is, but if it's something you could translate, for example, to a webinar by talking people through stuff, giving them documents. If it's role playing, for example, if it's stuff they can do verbally, I would just do that straight away. And I wouldn't get hung up on trying to overcomplicate the translation process, by which I mean, if you've got a game that you do face to face where people talk and respond, or maybe look at scenarios, or take it in turns to guess answers or something like that, you could just do that in a live webinar straight away, and I would urge you to do so. And I wouldn't get hung up about whether you need to kind of give it a rich kind of graphical layer, or adapt it to having kind of characters or animations or anything like that, because a lot of the time that stuff gets in the way of an effective dynamic that connects the learner to the content, to the facilitator. And if you've got a strong way of doing it already, just do it in a simple lift and shift manner would be my suggestion. Sarah, I think we're almost at the end of the webinar now.
We are. I've got just a couple of questions. I just wanted to say, there's a question from Hazel on recommended podcast software. Hazel, I'm going to put that over to Patrick for next week's webinar on tools. But there is what I think is a very nice suggestion from Fiona, which is just, can you use podcasts for more formal learning and then run a webinar as a follow-up to have more interaction and questions and answers? Which seems to me like a really good blended learning idea. What do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, precisely. That's exactly the kind of thing I would have said. So I completely endorse that. All I would add to that is, unless there's a particular reason not to use other media types, I would add documents into the mix, because you can't scan a podcast. You have to listen to the whole thing. So if there are some key points you want to put into a diagram or some FAQs, I wouldn't be shy of using text to bolster that, and it might help you to deepen and broaden your content library. So if you had a combination of podcasts, how-to guides, and a webinar, for me that sounds like quite a compelling content offering.
Thanks, that's great. That's the end of the questions that we have. Dan?
Okay, brilliant. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Do feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you'd like to know more about what I do as a practitioner. You can find out more extensive details of the kind of things a learning designer does there, and it would be good to connect with you all. So thanks for attending. Sarah, would you now like to tell people about the upcoming elements of the program, for example, Patrick? And also, I know people have been asking about accessing copies of the slides later on.
Yes, yes, thanks everybody, and particularly thanks to Dan. We're going to be running this webinar again next Tuesday. You can find all of the links on the resource page on www.ufi.co.uk/resources, where you can register for next Tuesday, which will be a rerun, but obviously there's an opportunity to ask more questions. We will email you a link to the recording of this webinar. Please give us a bit of time to do that, because the file is large and takes a long time to render, so we won't be emailing you until at least the end of this afternoon. The link to the recording will be available on the resource page, and we'll also put up a standalone copy of the slides if you just want to look at the slides without listening to all of us. Next week, Patrick, that's this time next Thursday, Patrick Dunn is going to be talking about online tools. And the focus of that is very much, how do you make a decision? Where do you start? There's loads of tools out there. What sort of questions should I be asking? How do I start to make sense of all of this huge tools landscape? So looking forward to that. I have other potential webinars in the pipeline, which I'm still finalizing, but one of those is going to be on promotion and using social media to promote your learning. And we're also going to be looking at monetizing your learning offer as well. If you have further requests or further ideas for webinars, Faye's going to be sending you a feedback request. And so we'd also like you to have a think about what areas you'd particularly like webinars on, so we can look at putting those into the program. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's great to have so many people here, and look forward to seeing you next week on the tools webinar. Oh, and by the way, feel free to share the link to the resources with anybody. We're putting these on, it's all free, and the whole aim is to try and help people move their learning online as quickly as possible in this time when we've all got movement restrictions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.